Hello everybody, I'm Don Counts. Welcome into Fayetteville Public Utilities Channel 6. Today we are going to be talking about a book that I just got. It's called The Rise and Fall of a Construction Giant, The History, People, and Stories of CFW Construction. That is going to be a great story for you to read. I'd like to introduce you to the author of that this book here, Dick Farrar Jr. How you doing, Dick?
Fine, Don.
Good
Thanks
to
for
see
having me.
Absolutely. You have a lot of stories to tell. You have lived a very full life. And tell everybody, let's just start out by telling everybody a little bit about your life and what led you to CFW.
Don, I grew up on a farm out on Mimosa Road in the early 40s. And a farm boy at hand, and my father got into construction in the late 40s, and I began riding around in the pickup truck with him. I think it was a 1946 Chevrolet, over construction jobs. And back in those days, there were no child labor laws, so you could kind of do what you wanted to do.
Right.
And I guess I was in the way more than I was a help to anyone. But when I looked around, I was 11 years old when CFW, first big project was the General Shoe Project. And I started carrying water there that summer. But when I thought about this book in later years, I looked around and I think I was the last man standing. And I thought CFW was a good story, and that story needed to be preserved. So I began to put together some thoughts. I had some files. My father had some files. Friends of CFW had files. So it just kind of grew from that point on. I remember visiting with Mike Freeland in Hopkinsville, and Mike had written a couple of books, and we got to talking about CFW. And he said, "Dick, you need to write a book." Okay. And I'd finished the manuscript a little later on. I sent it to a family friend in Birmingham, Melinda Thompson, who had written 4 books, 2 bestsellers. Mm-hmm. She knew a little about writing books. Mm-hmm. She said, "Get to writing." Then I visited Ray Fraley, and I had some thoughts that maybe the book shouldn't be written. And Ray said, "Absolutely, get to writing." Mm-hmm. So from that point on, I just started writing, and this was about a 2-year journey, mm-hmm. really, from early 2017 until I finished the book.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a great story. How does CFW, you mentioned General Shoe Company, and you can mention many other things that they did just here locally, and then we'll talk about what they did globally, but and especially in the United States. But let's talk about how CFW started and the roots there, how it all got started, and then we'll talk about how it grew.
Great. It started back in 1949. Mr. Carter, and a story about that. Later in my CFW career, Mr. Carter came to me one day and he says, "Dickie, it's time you stop calling me Mr. Carter, and time I stop calling you Dickie. From now on, it's Bill. So when I refer to Mr. Carter, mm-hmm. I will probably say Bill." Mm-hmm. But anyway, Bill Carter was teaching at the University of Tennessee, 1947, and taught 2 years there. And he'd promised Dean Granger there, the civil engineering dean, that he would only teach 2 years. And he came back in 1949, and on his first week back, Mac Hamilton called him, Mac Hamilton Construction, and said, "Bill, they're going to let a bid on the new sewer plant here in Fayetteville, and I'd like for you to help me bid it. And if we're successful, I'd like for you to help me build it." Bill helped him bid it. They were successful, and Bill was superintendent of the Fayetteville sewer plant here in 1949-50, or 48-49. So once that was finished, he decided, "I just believe I want to do something on my own." And he had spotted a piece of land out what we call here Radio City that Mr. Joe Templeton owned, Templeton Pontiac Company. And Bill had bought a Pontiac from Mr. Templeton, and had a son by the name of Joe Wiley. So they became friends, and Mr. Carter began to ask questions about the property and wanted to build some houses. Mr. Betty Williams was in the Williams lumber building and supply building business, and so Bill decided to go to Mr. Williams and see if he would partner with him on building a few houses in the Radio City area. And remember, this was after the war, and people were beginning starter homes and things coming back from the service and getting ingrained in the work life. And so Bill and Mr. Williams formed Carter Williams Construction Company to build houses in Radio City. Well, they got into the project, and Bill says, we need to get the city to put in the water sewer system. So he went to Ed Payne, who was the city clerk, called the city clerk at that time, city administrator today. And Ed said, what do you mean we, Bill? That's your project. And he kind of, being a civil engineer, I think that kind of embarrassed him, but not getting all the work done before starting building houses. But my mother, Robbie Farrar, and Robbie Poole was first cousin to Bill. And they were great friends, and so Mother would invite Bill and Jane Carter to dinner occasionally, and so Bill and my father got to talking about forming a partnership to do the utility work. And Dad was a good farmer and had saved up a little money, and so he decided that the farming life wasn't going to be his career, so he wanted to do something else. And he joined Bill, and it was the Carter Williams Construction Company on one hand and Carter Farrar Construction on the other hand. And they put the water sewer into the Radio City area and built more houses. I think there were 3 phases to Radio City, and CFW was involved in all 3 phases. So then in 1952, it actually became Carter Farrar Williams. And in '52, it was shortened to CFW.
Well, that's a good story. You're talking about Radio City. That's the property, we'd say north of WKR out there for somebody who might not know where that's at.
Right,
But building the sewer after the fact, that we can relate to some of those things still happen today, so we can relate to that.
Sure.
And then you're looking at our sewer plant, which is now Fayetteville Public Utility Sewer.
Yes.
That was a huge operation, building even today. It's and very well done too, actually.
Right.
Let's talk a little bit about some other projects that made CFW bloom and get just huge as they, and talk about how big CFW got. You know, people my age and below might not remember how big it really was.
It was a giant, and the book, The Rise and Fall of a Giant Construction Company. But the first project, of course, as we mentioned, was a 1951 General Shoe plant. And actually it was built under the Carter Williams name because CFW wasn't fully formed at the time. From there, it evolved into the Fayetteville Housing Project, 1953. Between 53 and 73, I believe there were 521 units built, housing units built by Fayetteville Housing Project. CFW built 251 of those.
Wow.
So that General Shoe plant, the widening of North Main. You know, our young people here don't remember when North Main was a 2-lane highway from Washington Street around to Bright Avenue.
Wow.
CFW 4-laned North Main Avenue. Mm-hmm. Fayetteville Housing Project, I mentioned that. And then the 1959 was Serban Manufacturing out on the Pulaski Highway.
Wow, they built that big building.
Right,
wow.
Built that big building. Mm-hmm. And then there were a lot of small sewer projects. Madison, Tennessee, McMinnville, Tennessee, East Ridge, Tennessee, Murfreesboro, Tennessee. And the first out-of-state project was Madisonville, Kentucky in 1954. So it began to grow from there, and over the years it was just multiple water sewer projects. Some of the people that may be known locally. Robert Maddox was a sewer superintendent, water superintendent. Sherman Maddox, his brother. By the way, interestingly, I was in the bookend yesterday, and while I was there, this lady calls from New Jersey, and it happened to be Sherman Maddox's daughter, Catherine,
Wow.
wanting to order some books.
Wow.
So while I was there, I signed a couple of books for Catherine.
Good.
Glad to hear from her. But there were a lot of, just for instance, during the building of the shoe plant, these people were coming out of the cotton fields wanting to go to work for 75 cents an hour rather than 75 cents a day.
Sure.
And it didn't matter what the job was, whether they were concrete finishers or whatever. Mm-hmm. They just did what needed to be done. Mm-hmm. There weren't any real trades back then, sure, as we know them today. So anyway, a lot of those, for example, Sherman Maddox started out as a laborer. Mm-hmm. Robert Maddox started out as a laborer. And those people just kept rising with the work and kept learning. And Bill Carter in those years, the 50s, would bid the work. And my father and Lewis Carter would put the equipment on the job, put the men on the job, put the material on the job, and trained a lot of those people to be good superintendents and foremen.
If me and you were going to go out and build a 8x10 shed, that would be an easy thing to bid. But William R. had to be pretty smart to know the ins and outs of some big place, even as something as simple as Genesco or some of the bridges and things that he did. That I wouldn't even know where to start. I think your book said it took about a week or maybe more to actually do a bid.
Right. In the early years, after Jack Kelser came to work, Jack Kelser was a brilliant civil engineer, and he was a student under Bill Carter at the University of Tennessee. And Bill recalled how bright and young this fellow was and energetic. So he called Jack and asked him to come to work. Jack came to work in 1956, I believe. Fred Young came to work fresh out of Georgia Tech in 1961 as a civil engineer. And those two paired together to take a little of the load off of Bill Carter in bidding the work for the company. And still, Lewis and my father would assemble all the equipment and the manpower to go build the job. I do remember my father and Jack bidding a job, and I believe my father and Jack's bid was something like $257,000. And that was back in a time when you took your bid into the city hall and put it on a table and sat there until they opened the bids.
It's called a sealed bid.
Sealed bid.
That's right.
And the $257,000 bid was lying there, and the first bid opened was something like $560,000. Well, these little beads of sweat broke out on my father and Jack. The next bid that was open was something like $525,000.
So he's thinking he's underbid.
Oh, man.
He's sweating.
He's sweating. So Dad instructs Jack to go up there and jerk the bid off the table. Yep. Well, when they got through reading the bids, the low bid was $250,000. So, you know, they were right in the money.
Sure.
But when and now the contractor that bid $570,000 probably had his platter loaded, didn't want to work, right, didn't care, but felt like he had to bid it.
Sure.
Those were instances all throughout the bidding process.
Wow. Well, to a guy who works in this business, it's very complicated to read some of the things that you talked about. One thing that some of the older generation will tell me, and I barely remember it, but was the humongous, large equipment that would leave here to go on jobs. That just blows my mind. They said sometimes they'd leave out like in a convoy to go into a job.
True. The company in 4950 started out with was a Bantam backhoe, which was a rubber tire rig on an Army base and cable operated. Well, equipment evolves over the years. The first 4 pieces of equipment that CFW had was the Bantam backhoe, a 105 air compressor, a Huff front end loader, and I forget the other piece. But anyway, eventually evolved. The second piece was a track backhoe, cable backhoe. And then the first Caterpillar was a front end loader back in 1954. Well, over the years, construction equipment evolves into hydraulics, and you begin to get into the hydraulic equipment. And then when Fred Young came to work for the company, the engineers were beginning to design projects that had 24-inch, 36-inch, 54-inch, 60-inch diameter pipe, sewer and water.
Sure.
So the bigger the pipe, the bigger the equipment. So Fred got us into the big pipe business because a lot of contractors at that time were afraid, actually didn't have the capital to buy the bigger equipment, take on the bigger jobs. So that gave us a niche that other contractors weren't getting into. And CFW began into the big pipe business. And I think the confidence level at that time we knew we could do the small pipe diameter work without any trouble. And we, first 2 or 3 jobs in the big pipe, the confidence level built, we could do that. And then lo and behold, in the 60s, we took on the Wilson Tunnel in Nashville, Tennessee. That was, once we finished that project with a profit and on time, any project that came along, we knew we could do.
Well, you're talking about some of the pipe that you laid, and I know you know this, across the United States. Some of that pipe that y'all laid back then is still being in use today, and now is in the process of needing to be rehabbed.
That's right.
And so it's all caught up with us at one time, because at the time y'all were putting it in, it was the first time it was put in.
Right.
It was sort of new, is that correct?
Right. And even the construction techniques have evolved over time. As you know today, FBU is largely, it's boring underneath without digging up the streets and all of that, as we used to do.
Sure.
So the technology from the 50s, 60s, and 70s has really changed in the 90s and the 2000s.
One thing that you have in your book, and you mentioned it was available at the bookend, and that's really, really good right here in town. You can go get one. One of the things you flip through is some of the best pictures. I mean, it's unbelievable how you come up with a collection of so many of these. You have machines, you have places you went, places you were working. How did you collect all those pictures and keep those and find them?
During the forming process of writing the book, I wrote several of the former employees that I knew were still around and could find their address, and asked them if they had any old newsletters, old memos, and things like that. And some of those people that I asked for help sent me some. Fred Young sent me a file of old memos. My father had saved a lot of those things over the years. I had accumulated a lot. So it was just, as you'll notice, the book is kind of divided into decades. So I had to go back through all of this material and take the 1950 memos and things, then the 60s, 70s, and then I began to put together a story.
Well, your boss, William R. Carter, wrote a lot of memos.
Oh, God. Ooh. We dreaded seeing those come out. And it was kind of a joke. Some of the foremen on the job decided to say, you know, I'm going to have a college engineer just to do my paperwork. Because they assigned it. Fred really, and Mr. Carter really wanted everybody, the building of the project needed to coincide with the bidding of the project.
Right.
And in a lot of cases, the field superintendents disregarded the bid and just built it, which of course it had to be done.
Right.
But you had to build it within the confines of the budget that was set for the project.
Sure.
And had to finish it on time. And Fred gave us bar charts, you know, this portion of the job has to be finished by this date, this portion has to be finished by this date, and we got to finish it on time and build it on time and build it on budget.
Well, how many employees did CFW have in its heyday?
About 1,500.
Wow.
But we have estimated that at least 16,000 to 17,000 people received a paycheck from CFW over the years.
Wow. Well, what about your job? What was your job? It evolved from the very beginning to what did you wind up being involved in it?
Over the years, Don, as I say, started out in summer work from 1951 through 1961 and went full-time in 1962. Graduated from Mississippi State, married in August, and the last of August and the first week of September, I was running a project in Verona, Mississippi, as superintendent of that project. We finished that project, and fortunately, Tupelo, Mississippi was letting a $2 million project about the time we were finishing Verona. And Verona was to Tupelo what Petersburg is to Fayetteville, just kind of a suburb. And so I moved to Tupelo, Martha and I moved to Tupelo, and we worked there for about 3 years building the Tupelo project. And I enjoyed that, but then from there it was sewer and water work across Knoxville, Nashville. I was somewhat involved in the tunnel work in Nashville, enjoyed that. And then Mr. Carter wanted me to come into the office to take over the safety part of the company.
You mentioned safety in the book, and one thing about that is that you go from, you talk about how you were around when OSHA was formed in Tennessee, OSHA, whatever the TOSHA.
Right. Well, the federal government put law into effect, I believe it was under President Nixon, 1972 or 3, and the law says they could come into your business anytime and inspect it, and if you were in violation of certain rules and all, and the penalties and the fines were tremendous, especially if it was the second violation was a willful fine, and automatically a $75,000 fine. So you had to be careful. But then Tennessee OSHA, the federal government gave the states the right to form their own OSHA program. And Tennessee put together a very good OSHA program. And Tennessee didn't drive OSHA down your throats as the federal government was doing early on. They would come in and help you with seminars and things of that nature.
Sure.
And we really appreciated the part that the Tennessee OSHA people, and they were our friends.
Working in the utility business, we definitely know what that's like, but when you're doing the kind of things you're doing, and even the kind of things we do in this utility, there's a lot of dangerous things, from same thing that y'all did back then, shoring up ditches to keep them from caving in. I'm sure you had some people get hurt.
Yes, we did. We lost, my first experience was that when 1954-5, CFW was remodeling the Holman Hill Reservoir, and a fellow fell from a scaffold to the concrete and died. And then summer in McMinnville, I worked with Harold Wayne Colbert, and my job at McMinnville was, back then we had what we call the old pour joint pipe. You had to put, we called a snake around the pipe and then pour hot tar around it, and that glued the joints together. And so my job was to heat the tar and have it ready for the pipe layers when they got there at 7 o'clock. So I had to get up 5 o'clock in the morning. Well, Harold Wayne would come out in the morning and help me with the tar, and also pick up all the flares that we put around the construction equipment. Back then you didn't have the blinking lights or the orange cones or the barrels that are today.
So you had a flaming flare.
Flaming flare.
Wow.
And so Harold and I would get everything ready for the work day, and then at night my job was to put the flares out, and Harold Wayne would help me there. Well, as I went back to school in September, Dad came in one afternoon and said to my mother, "We lost a man today." And I heard Mother say, "Who?" And he said, "Harold Wayne."
Oh.
And construction was dangerous. He was killed in a ditch cave-in. And I don't recall another person being killed in a ditch cave-in during my time there. After we trench jacks and
Sure.
the old screw jacks evolved to hydraulic jacks, and then from that, the bigger pipe, we used the trench shields, which were very expensive, and but safety was, you didn't sacrifice production. You didn't sacrifice safety for production.
Absolutely. Now, your book talks about some times where you escaped death quite a few times. So we're lucky you're here today to even tell your story, as a lot of us. But you might tell the story about the plane crash that you were supposed to be in. Maybe tell people a little bit about that. A lot of people might not know about that.
It's still tough, Don.
Yeah.
That was November 1st, 1979. We left the Fayetteville Airport about daybreak to go to Houston, Texas. I think there were 3 or 4 on the plane there to go to Houston, and we had multiple jobs in the Houston area, road building, grading and paving work, telephone work. So there were 3 of us that left for Houston on different missions. And we agreed to be back at Hobby Airport late in the afternoon to catch the plane back home. I had contacted Mike Knox at our New Orleans office that day, and Mike had already said that he and his wife Rhonda would like to take a vacation, and Mike very much needed a vacation at that time, as I recall. And I said, well, Mike, I'll meet you in Baton Rouge, and if you're going on vacation, I'll stay and take your place. If you decide not to go, I'll get on the plane and come home, but at least give us a few minutes to talk. Well, we landed in Baton Rouge, and I met Mike, and the pilot had cut the left engine off, left the right engine running because I was going to run in. So Mike says, Mr. Farrar, if you don't mind, Rhonda and I would like to take a vacation. I said, well, let me go get my briefcase and my bag. And told the pilot to go ahead, I was staying. Well, later that night, I forget the timing, but that plane crashed in Nashville at the airport, hitting the TVA lines coming in from the north. And I'd had a room there at the Holiday Inn near the Baton Rouge airport. And the phone rang the next morning. And my wife said, are you okay? And I said, yeah, I'm fine, what's wrong? She said, did you not hear about the plane crash? And I said, no, I thought you was talking about some airliner crashing. And she said, CFW plane crashed last night, and all 5 on board were killed. And
These are people you knew, people you were just on the plane with, and they were young. I think all of them were under 30, right?
There were 2 ladies, and one worked for the Ed Blank's secretary. Ed was from Columbia, and he was a senator at the time. Mm-hmm. Well, the other part of that story is Reese Howell had taken Ed Blank, Mr. Carter, and 2 other senators from the state to Washington that day because the vice president from the United States was announcing for
running for president.
Well,
I can't remember.
We'll take it.
Yeah,
I can see it. But anyway, he was from Tennessee. Was announcing his run for president. So Reese was on his way back from Nashville when somebody called him over the intercom and said, told him about the airplane crash. And Fayetteville was fogged in, the Nashville airport was fogged in, and Reese said the only hole I could find in the sky was Shelbyville. Said we landed at Shelbyville, and I immediately took a car to Nashville, to the airport with Mr. Carter to find out what was going on there. So the 2 ladies from Nashville were in Houston visiting some relatives, and they wanted to know if they could hitch a ride back with CFW's plane. And Lex Carter arranged, Lex was in Houston at the time, Lex arranged for them to be on the plane because there was room for them. Palm Pitts was an attorney, civil engineer, and an attorney who was working for the company at the time. Bob Rose, who was president of Brown Brothers, a subsidiary of CFW, was on the plane. And two pilots, Jimmy Holder and Tommy Kinzer. And so they left Baton Rouge, dropped Bob off in Chattanooga, and then went on to Nashville. And that's where the crash, and those 5 then on board were killed instantly.
Your book says that that was labeled pilot error. However, I think it goes on to say that Reese Howe from here, who is a legendary pilot, proved that that wasn't the case.
He did. I don't recall all the details, but even a week ago, Reese, 5 years later, the insurance companies determined that it was not pilot error.
Wow.
That it was a mechanical failure of the plane. Wow. And the court records were not unsealed, so we never did know for sure just what the payments and all were from the insurance company.
As we talk about the continue of the book, the rise and fall of the construction giant, we've talked about the rise, and it's we could talk about it all day. But I guess we need to go ahead and talk about the fall because something as big as how big was CFW? I mean, it's like top 10 in the nation or whatever. So it was one of the largest construction companies in the Southeast for sure.
Yes, in the world.
In the world.
In 1974, CFW was ranked in the top 100 construction companies in the world. Did a volume that year of something like 80 million. I think 1980, the volume was something like 90 million.
Wow.
And when you multiply that by 12, that's almost $8 million a month in billing.
Wow.
So it took a lot to make us one of the largest companies.
Headquartered in Fayetteville, Tennessee.
Fayetteville, Tennessee, right.
Yeah. Did the people here at home realize how big CFW was?
I don't think so. I was talking to Joe Lester from Pulaski, who heads Harton Realty in Tullahoma now. And Joe read the book, and he said, you know, people really didn't realize what a giant CFW was. He said, I knew it because I was in the development business.
Sure.
But he said, you just don't realize that a company doing $80 million a year can be located in a town of 25,000, 30,000.
Sure. You've always had big dreams, big hopes for our community, even to this day. But you actually have seen something start small and go to you've seen a dream come true. Let's talk a little bit about the fall. Did the fall happen slowly or did it happen fast?
Rapidly, from 1978 to 1982, 83 was the demise, and it fell pretty rapidly. Bid rigging, Don, is wrong.
Okay.
I can be the first to say it. But it was a practice that was just done over the years. Mr. Carter grew into it. CFW grew into it, and it was primarily in the road building business. And I hesitate to say this, but you and I get in a room and we talk about a bid in Fayetteville, and you say, I'd like to have this work. Well, okay, I had the last job, it's your turn. I'm going to bid 100,000, you bid 98,000.
Right.
And that's bid rigging.
Okay.
And then collectively in the 60s, Tennessee Highway Department of Transportation would have a bid letting in Nashville on such and such a date. Well, all the contractors would gather the night before, go out to dinner, go back to the room, bid their work, but during dinner they would talk over well, I'd like to have this job. Or my company is located in Dyersburg, Tennessee. There are 3 jobs in Dyersburg.
Sure.
Could I have them? You
Sure.
know, things of that nature.
Yeah.
But it was wrong. It was wrong. And I think everybody knew it was wrong. Well, the Justice Department in 1978 started out in Indiana and found bid rigging going on there. And somebody said, as I recall, if you really want the big dogs, go down to Tennessee. Well, the Justice Department comes into Tennessee. I understand their first stop was in Shelbyville with the Tillett brothers. They looked at the files there. They found bid rigging. They found CFW in the files. They come to Fayetteville. They look at the files here. They find other contractors in the file. I think there were eventually 13 construction executives who went to prison in the state of Tennessee over bid rigging.
So this cost CFW a lot of money, plus William R. Carter went to prison.
That's true. Not only did William R. Carter go to prison, Fred Young went to prison because the Justice Department went into South Carolina and started looking at files there, and they found CFW. They came back to Mr. Carter and cited him again for bid rigging in South Carolina, but the judge in Tennessee, the U.S. judge in Tennessee, had already said, you level with us and you won't serve any more time. Well, Ed Blank had to remind them of what the judge in Tennessee, the U.S. judge in Tennessee had said. So Mr. Carter didn't have to serve any time for the South Carolina bid rigging, but it was water sewer work, and Fred Young, who was bidding the work in South Carolina, and also Preston Carroll Construction Company, Frank Shepard's vice president. Fred and Frank had to serve time as a result of bid rigging in South Carolina.
Where were you when you heard this, and what were your thoughts? You thought he'd get out of it? You thought this is going to have to write a check and
no, you know, still water runs deep, and no, it wasn't. The fines were tremendous. The embarrassment.
Sure.
It was just in my deepest belief, and I think I said this in the book, I think the Tennessee Highway Department of Transportation knew bid rigging was going on. Mm-hmm. They would let maybe $100 billion or $200 billion worth of work in a day's time. Mm-hmm. Well, if CFW was a successful bidder, it wouldn't be a week till we would hear from the Commissioner of Highways, congratulations on your bid. And within 5 minutes, he would say, would you be willing to make a political contribution of $1,000, $5,000 to so-and-so's campaign?
Sure.
That was their way of, I guess you might say, honoring bid rigging mm-hmm. in return for campaign contributions.
Sure.
So the Tennessee Road Builders got smart, and they formed their own political action committee through the Tennessee Road Builders Association, so that any political contributions would have to come through the Tennessee Road Builders Association and get them out of this one-on-one situation with them.
Now, is that during Blanton's time, Governor Ray Blanton?
Governor Winfield Dunn was known as the highway governor of Tennessee.
Because during that time, we mentioned earlier how sewer needed to be done. Roads really needed some work during those days.
Oh yes, definitely. And but now I'm not implicating Blanton or Dunn or any of the others.
I didn't mean to go there.
As far, but of course, Ray Blanton was in the construction business. Right. He was a Blanton construction company.
And he lived in Fayetteville. Most people might not know that at one time.
Lived in Fayetteville at one time.
Most people don't know
And
that.
his brother Gene Blanton worked for CFW at one time. So, and Ray would come down to our dove hunts. I know he came to one. Mm-hmm. And Gene would come. So, it was just a friendly atmosphere among politicians and governors. And I think Lewis Carter and Winfield Dunn went to Canada fishing together at one time. So
A lot of politics in anything, but especially in big business.
well, probably so.
Well, there's so many great stories in the book. The price of bid rigging basically demised CFW.
It's hard to put a number to it. I think the fines were somewhere in the $4 million range. The legal fees somewhere in the $4 to $5 million range. And then the distractions, and there were divorces through this time. Sure. There were deaths through this time. There were people leaving the company through this time. I think Mr. Carter said in his book, Unto These Hills, that the bottom line will never be known, but would be somewhere around $12 to $15 million.
And no telling what that would be in today's
dollars.
You know, it's a great book. We know it's at the Book Inn and many other places people can get it, but we'd like for you to get it right here locally. I know you're proud of that, but if you're watching this anywhere in the United States or world or whatever, the wide world of internet, you can get it on all the places around too. But I would like to ask you one thing. You've got so many great stories in here. I just wondered if there's a story or a story that you would, it's not in the book, that you'd like to tell about those days.
I'm sure if I had more time to think about it, but Don, I really think that the book is about people.
Yeah.
And for example, integration was happening with CFW long before we knew integration, because I think probably Winston Ford and John Whitaker were two blacks. They were hired at the shoe plant, probably two of the first hires. Mm-hmm. I remember at Verona, Mississippi, I was working Winston Ford there at Verona and three others, and they would get in their old 49 Ford on Monday morning about 3 o'clock, ride to Verona for a day's work or a week's work. But Winston would come in a little bit later every Monday morning. And this happened on 3 or 4 occasions. So I finally told Winston, and I'd warned him, Winston, we got to have you here on time. So he came in one morning, Monday morning about 11. And I said, Winston, here's $20, head back home, I don't need you anymore. So that shut an entire crew down. Later on in the afternoon, I went over to where that crew was supposed to be working, and I was going to kind of size things up as to what we needed to do to get it going. And lo and behold, Winston and his crew were there working. They didn't go home. I said, Winston, I thought I sent you home. He said, yes, sir, but I went and called Mr. Billy, and he told me to go on back over here and go to work. And that's when I learned about seniority. Winston was one of the first hires of Mr. Carter, so
yeah.
I just kind of laughed and let it go.
You've learned a lot. You've been through a lot. I thank you for sharing this book with our community and the world, the rise and fall of a construction giant, the history, people, and stories of CFW construction. And you're right about one thing. This book is about people, which CFW might have been William R. Carter and your father and the other folks, but it starts from people.
Right.
And you had evidently some good people, it took a lot of people to make something turn into a giant.
Yes, sir.
We appreciate you writing the book. We thank you for coming and talking to us about it. And we want to encourage everybody to go get this book and get all the stories. And it's worth it just for the pictures, if you like pictures. And then at the end, there are some stories from some of the people that work there.
Great stories.
Great stories.
That's right.
Yeah. Thank you very much. We've had Dick Farrar Jr. Again, I want to thank you for talking to us and thank you for coming. And I hope you sell a lot of these, because it's going to be something that I think people will enjoy for years to come.
Thank you very much, Don.
We appreciate you watching here on Fayetteville Public Utilities Channel 6. I'm Don Counts, and we'll see you back in here next time.